If you'd just like to take your seats, if you haven't got one already. So it's really wonderful to be here with all of you this evening, whether you're in person or indeed you're online, joining us online. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Lydia, and I am a member of the Practical Theology faculty, and I am also just finishing up my PhD also in Practical Theology. And it's a pleasure to have you here with us for the annual Sydney Martin Lecture. So before I welcome up our speaker, I'll just tell you, for those of you who don't know, a little bit about Sydney Martin, the man whose name lends itself to the lectures, and then I'll introduce Manon. So yeah, these lectures are named for Sydney Martin, who was a 20th century Nazarene pastor. Reverend Dr. Sydney Martin was born on the 23rd of October, 1910 in Sacriston, County Durham, into a Methodist family. He was a minister who had a significant influence in the city of Glasgow in the 1950s and 60s. He was a minister at the Sharp Memorial Church in Parkhead for 25 years, and he was passionate about preaching. And it was rumoured that he spent up to 26 hours per week in preparation to preach 2 sermons every Sunday, each about 30 minutes each, plus a Wednesday evening meditation at the church prayer meeting. Wow. He also lectured at NTC from time to time in pastoral theology, and the study desks in our library, those of you who are familiar with the library, were given to the college in his memory. No snideness there. He died in 2004, and now each year we hold the Sydney Martin Lecture, and it always has a practical and social theology focus to reflect his ministry. So this evening, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Manon Caridron-James, who will deliver our lecture this evening. And I have to tell you that those of us in the Practical Theology department already had a brilliant afternoon with her as she led a colloquium for some of us PhD students and supervisors, and it was just full of energy and we loved it. So Dr. Manon Caridron-James is Dean for Initial Ministerial Training at the St Padern's Institute, Church of Wales, and she teaches, Church in Wales, and she teaches practical theology and theology and contemporary culture. She has published Women, Identity and Religion in Wales, Theology, Poetry and Story, and that was in 2018. And also she's published studies on feminist theology and qualitative research and on humour and theology. An Anglican priest, she was one of the first women to be ordained in the church in Wales, and in her free time she writes poetry, sometimes performs stand-up comedy, which I think is incredibly brave, and attends comedy events and football matches with her husband Dylan. And so, as you know, this evening's lecture's title is Anything Just a Joke? Insights from Theology, Humour and Comedy. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Manon Caridron-James.
So, what do you call a man who has lost his magic? Well, I'm an Anglican, I'm not saying anything. Ian. Now, that is my favourite joke of the moment, and because I've delivered this, something similar to this lecture before, and I haven't been very funny, and I've just sort of imagined that people are kind of wandering home from the lecture thinking, well, she wasn't very funny, was she? I thought I should start with a joke, but anyway. My other favourite joke is What's black and white and eats like a horse? A zebra. So that gives you a sense of what my humour is like. It's not quite, it's a little bit left field. Anyway, as you know, senses of humour. All right, I'm clicking this and it's making that noise. There we are. So that's a picture of me doing stand-up there, as you can see. So, I wouldn't say that I'm a very jokey person in the sense of telling jokes, but I would like to think that I'm somebody who uses humour in my ministry and in my teaching. I hardly ever use jokes like that in my sermons. Now, senses of humour vary, don't they? Some people like puns, others of us like political jokes or satire. Some of us can have quite a dark sense of humour, which can sometimes get us into trouble, and that's something I'm going to talk about a bit later. But think about the last time that you laughed. Was it watching TV, or maybe a joke amongst friends or family, teasing someone, or maybe something you found bizarre or ridiculous? How would you describe your sense of humour? Has it ever got you into trouble? I first began to be interested in this topic when I realised how important humour was to my life, that I used it to build rapport with people, that my relaxation time was very often about comedy. And as I say, I've even tried my hand at stand-up to see what I can learn for preaching and public speaking. Now, the practical theologian Stephen Patterson has argued that laughter is one of the things that makes life worth living. As it helps build rapport between people, it makes difficult situations bearable. It can also lift us out of ourselves and even seem almost like a holy or religious experience. However, often Christians like to keep their humour separate from their faith, which I think is a huge mistake if the Christian life is about joy and, as I argue later, play. Now, in part, I think this is to do with fear about offence and boundaries. Joking can be dangerous. Jokes considered to be offensive can lead to public outcry, even the sack. So-called cancel culture can lead to the humiliation of those who make an offensive joke in the wrong context. And to be cancelled is almost a form of social death, where someone is regarded as unacceptable without a role or voice within the public sphere. So in this lecture, I'm first going to explore the function of humour, then briefly look at the historical and theological context, moving on to explore the role of stand-up comedy as both bad and good, and ending with some personal insights about humour and ministry. Now, I won't be able to cover everything, but I'm very happy to answer questions at the end about any aspect, really. Now, on this slide, you can see that I've written 3 chapters on humour. So the first is a chapter on the comedian Stuart Lee, and that hasn't come out yet, but is in a book called Religion and Senses of Humour. And there are 2 chapters in books that have already come out. So one is Future Faith, and I've got a section there about humour and pastoral care. And then Theology, Religion and the Office. I don't know if we've got any American Office fans here. Oh, it's about a third of you are American Office fans. Well, I've written a chapter on the 2 episodes, Diversity Day and Sexual Harassment. So that tells you that I'm not afraid of tackling difficult subjects. So a lot of these works have been around offence and what can be joked about and can't, and cancel culture. So I'm happy to discuss that at the end if you want to discuss that further. So first of all, we're going to look at the function of humour. So humour theorists argue that humour is an innate part of being human. For example, even children who are born deaf and blind laugh. We are also judged on our sense of humour, and people who lack humour are seen as deficient as personalities. So humour is socially important. It contributes positively to our well-being, and helps our intellectual flexibility and ability to process ideas. So remember that if you're putting in an essay late or a section of a PhD, remember, tell your tutor that you're actually working on your intellectual flexibility. Now, different cultures have their own norms about what is appropriate to laugh about, but even so, laughter is the same or sounds the same in every culture. So it's a significant part of being human and being in relationship with each other. Now, even if theorists are agreed that humour is socially important, there is less agreement about why. Humour has been theorised as fundamentally aggressive or about superiority, as a form of catharsis and a mechanism to cope with suffering, as well as a way of playing with boundaries and taboos. Others have maintained that humour arises from incongruity and needn't involve superiority or aggression. In fact, all these theories are probably true. Humour is a complex phenomenon. How do you say that word? Phenomenon. And has considerable variety. Now, humour can be seen as a form of play and as an experience of flow or even of liminality. So humour is an in-between and playful space where ordinary rules and norms are momentarily ignored or turned on their head. For example, somebody who writes a lot about humour, Bernard Schweitzer, although he regards religion and humour as odd bedfellows, he writes that although suspicious of each other, they are quite inseparable because both belong in the liminal sphere in invoking transcendental experiences, or are countercultural, evoking the counterworld of the satire of the holy fools. So laughter as a liminal in-between state is further reinforced by a view that it is about absence of feeling, with the humour theorist Sophie Quirk quoting Henri Bergson that the comic demands something like a momentary anaesthesia of the heart. There is something of entering a new or parallel world in comedy where society's rules and practices are turned on their head. So humour as a place of liminality is also about creating and stepping over boundaries. There is a playfulness in this which is important, but it also notes that the boundary is there. So we're going to go back now to Bernard Schweitzer, and he comments that occasionally humour can shift the boundary, but more commonly it simply exposes the existence of a boundary, playing creatively with it, and showing possible alternatives to its current incarnation. The technical term to refer to such an involvement with boundaries is liminality. Liminal rhetoric playfully re-evaluates and critically questions and inspects borders, whether they are set by authorities, opinion makers, traditions, creeds, or psychological needs. So, humour is innate, has an important social function in helping build rapport and gain catharsis. It helps us understand ourselves better and is a way of playing with truths, even saying some difficult things and challenging power. It helps us understand boundaries of what can and can't be said. Unfortunately, the nearer the boundary something is, the funnier it is, and that's why humour is a risky business. And this is why it's vital that theology engages with comedy and humour, especially in the public square. Unfortunately, theology, and especially the Christian tradition, has a well-deserved reputation for being anti-humour. My argument would be that we need to fully engage with it, as it is a fundamental aspect of being human, and not be afraid of discussing boundaries. We need to give people the tools to evaluate humour, especially a way of helping people discuss ethics and values in comedy, rather than being afraid or simply negative. So, what part has humour played in theology and Christian history? Now, I'm afraid this is going to be a little bit of a whistle-stop tour. So, laughter and humour have always been a contested area within theology, embedded within debates about embodiment and spirituality. Roger Hayden Mitchell has argued that there are two streams of Christianity. one which is concerned with power, authority and control, and the other with mysticism and the believer's direct access to God. Hierarchy versus equality, church order versus disorder, conformity versus non-conformity. So if we place laughter and humour on this polarity, within the tradition we have John Chrysostom's assertion that Jesus never laughed, and interpretations of St. Benedict's rule that it is more appropriate for a monk to weep than to laugh, alongside a chaotic and colourful medieval Christianity, what Michael Bakhtin would call carnival. Bakhtin's proposition was that laughter and carnival was countercultural and an important satirical critique of the Church's power. Church authorities have been able to control most aspects of church life and teaching, but they haven't been able to control laughter. So this could be one reason why laughter and humour hasn't been explored much within theology. However, in practice, there have been some key practices and traditions where humour has been significant. The Fool for Christ and Easter laughter. Have you heard of Easter laughter? But most of you have heard of the Holy Fool tradition, I'd imagine, or that's a bit more well known, isn't it? Yeah. So the Holy Fool trope is not just Christian nor even religious. The comedian Stuart Lee describes the historical role of the fool in a book about stand-up, and in this case, who he calls Heyoka, the clown of the Sioux nation, who washes in dirt, walks around backwards, stands on his head, sleeps outside. He lives every moment in subversion in opposition to conventional social norms. So lots of different cultures have this sort of fool tradition, haven't they? This trope even appears in our own Western tradition, doesn't it? In jesters, clowns, and so on. However, the Holy Fool, the outwardly insane person who spoke the truth, often to power, has been an important trope and even occasionally role within Christian theology. And the idea of the Holy Fool originates in the biblical writings of St. Paul about followers being fools for Christ, and the practices of some early Christian ascetics using madness and countercultural behaviours in order to satirise or challenge their society. We see it in Orthodox traditions, saints such as the Russian St. Basil from the 16th century, who walked barefoot in the snow and publicly rebuking Ivan the Terrible for his cruelty. Now, my favourite is on the picture there in the cartoon. So another well-known holy fool was St. Simeon of Emesa, a Syrian 6th century monk, known for dragging a dead dog as if he was taking it for a walk on the streets, overturning tables and throwing nuts at people in church. Now, this practice seems to have been a direct challenge to the self-regarding world, denying practices of revered holy persons of their day, satirising their asceticism. Now, this free and embodied tradition is also seen in Easter laughter, which is more of a German-speaking world tradition, where priests at the Easter Mass would encourage their congregations to wild laughter, even using pantomimes, double entendres as part of their celebrations. Now, a current example is the Bishop of Passau in Bavaria, who is now a bit of a TikTok sensation, where people look forward eagerly to his funny stories on Easter Day. So this tradition within the German-speaking world reinforces the view of the resurrection as turning the world upside down as God's last laugh. We have a quote here, Doris Donnelly commenting, "Since the most extravagant joke of all took place on Easter Sunday, the victory against all odds of Jesus over death, the community of the faithful enters into the spirit of the season by sharing stories with unexpected endings, surprise flourishes, and a sense of humour." However, despite these traditions and practices, theologically humour has not really been explored much, despite praise, joy and freedom being an important part of the Christian faith, as I will now skip through in this next section. So we're now going to look at a few theological treatments of humour. So my interest in theology and humour started in part in response to Stephen Patterson's work, who I quoted at the beginning of this lecture, as well as my own interest in comedy as an art form. Now, Stephen was also my PhD supervisor, and I was asked about a couple of years ago to contribute to a book to commemorate his work. So I wanted to dig deeper really into his comments about theology, saying very little about humour. He actually argues that it's only in Reinhold Niebuhr that we find anything like a detailed theological assessment of humour and laughter. He suggests this could be because humour is a visceral, embodied experience, which is not something that a dualistically inclined Christianity has wanted to explore, preferring the spiritual and the intellectual. He does, however, refer to some theological works which explore praise and joy. So he points to a book, Jubilate, by Daniel Hardy and David Ford, about praise, where they describe basic Christian existence as a laugh, and they refer approvingly to a poet, Patrick Kavanagh's description of the resurrection of Jesus as a laugh freed forever and ever. They argue that a theology and practice rooted in praise has joy, laughter, and freedom at its heart, along with generosity and the overflowing love of God. They put it succinctly as the message of life of joy with the God of joy. So it is possible, isn't it, to develop a theology of humour arising from praise and joy. Though I'm still left with the question, how come Christians are not often seen as joyful people, and certainly not pro-humour? So another key theologian who has written about humour from the opposite point of view, really, is Jacqueline Bussey in a book called The Laughter of the Oppressed. And she maintains that the relative lack of interest is because theology has been written by those in power, and up to now mainly men, and that powerful men find laughter intimidating because laughter is empowering for those without power. She encourages us to develop a theology of laughter from below, which challenges theology to be more hopeful and yet embracing of the reality of suffering, is not content with easy answers, but is willing to embrace honesty, suffering, and our lack of knowledge and understanding. Above all, she says, we need a theology of protest for our despair to turn into dissent. So in this, her work builds on Stephen Patterson, taking forward his identification of humour as a rich avenue for theological exploration. However, she is also building on that faint but living theological tradition that I've just mentioned, which sees laughter as significant as well as challenging of power and control within Christianity. A countercultural Christianity which values mysticism, freedom, and embodiment. So now I want to turn to the Bible itself, and again a bit of a whistle-stop tour. What does the Bible teach us about laughter? So there is a perception, isn't there, that the Bible has very little humour. And it is true that an analysis of how the Bible refers to laughter would seem to reinforce it as a sense of laughter as being hostile, not joyful. So we hear God's scornful laughter in Psalm 2 and Psalm 37. We hear the soldiers laughing mockingly at Jesus on the cross. Psalm 126 does mention laughter as a sign of joy, but this is quite unusual. This could be because in the ancient world, laughter was seen as about aggression and superiority. But if we dig deeper than just laughter as a kind of a visceral response, there is much to suggest that humour in its widest sense is prevalent both in the Old and the New Testaments. So, a biblical scholar, Terry Lindvall, has argued that the Hebrew prophets were satirists using holy wit to express their prophetic challenge. And although we hear in the Gospels that Jesus wept, but that he didn't laugh, It is clear that in the Gospel accounts we have what Carl Joseph Kuschel rightly refers to as the warm current of messianic joy in the character of Jesus of Nazareth. Barry Fry also, for example, refers to the gentle, life-affirming humour of the parables. It might be a stretch to develop a theology of laughter from the Bible, but it is possible to develop a theology of humour if we widen the concept of just laughter to incorporate joy, and in particular an appreciation of the gospel accounts of Jesus of Nazareth's use of incongruity, hyperbole, and a playing around with boundaries and taboos. That is the feature of humour. Therefore, the debate about whether the Christian tradition or the Bible is for or against humour is situated within wider debates within Christianity about embodiment, power, control, hierarchy, and church structures. Like so many of the natural human impulses, the church has sought to control to bolster its own power. For example, sexuality. Humour is also part of the human condition. It's a bodily response. So how can we as Christians and theologians become more positive about humour, and why is this important? I'd argue it's because jokes play an important part in public life, and it is vital that we play a part ourselves in these debates. However, first of all, I want to look at another link with theology and an exploration of play. So the work of the Japanese-American theologian Courtney Goto is important as we consider a practical theology of play. Although Goto does not explicitly link a theology of play to humour, in her book, The Grace of Playing, her insights offer a valuable framework for understanding joy and creativity in Christian life. So drawing on theologies of play, she describes revelatory experiencing in worship and learning as moments of encounter, connection, and transformation. These experiences are similar to mysticism and involve a sense of flow and imaginative engagement that transcends routine. She argues that play, often misunderstood as trivial, actually opens a liminal space where believers can embody God's new creation. Through rituals, liturgy, and even church architecture, play fosters creativity, relationality, and spiritual depth. Goto contrasts this with a repressive Christianity focused on control, suggesting that playful practices allow worshippers to reimagine the world and experience theology viscerally. In this way, play becomes holy, helps us enter into the new world of God's kingdom, where everything is turned upside down. Her work helps us see humour not as frivolous, but as a vital expression of hope and transformation in Christian faith. So this seems to fit in well, doesn't it, with the argument of Roger Hayden Mitchell about a countercultural Christianity running parallel with the hierarchical church structures, with mystics gaining direct access to God unmediated by the church. And here she is talking about Christian education. There are times when an everyday instance, she says, of religious education becomes thinner or translucent, allowing the divine mystery to be seen and felt, shining through the experience of being together. It can happen in the context of liturgy, Bible study, serving others, or the many other forms that religious education take. Not all the time, but once in a while, learners and teachers register something more. That experience often prompts one to be with others in new ways, leaving them unexpectedly change. So I think that sort of liminality, that kind of where being with a group of people in worship or in a teaching situation, somehow everything shifts and, God's kingdom breaks through. And she says that play and an appreciation of play is a very important aspect of that. So I think this also helps us understand humour as well within the Christian tradition, and helps us being able to develop a rounded theology which involves play as well. And I have to say that I also saw in my own ministry how laughter played an important part in how I related to people. So I wanted to explore the role of humour in ministry when I realised that it formed a major part of my own practice. So my last parish, I've been working now for about 10 years in diocesan work and now in theological education. But the two parishes where I worked before were Llandillas and Llysfaen. And we used to call ourselves Llandibli because of the characters there. But when I served there as rector, several of the key members of the church, and especially the other leaders, we all enjoyed a similar sense of humour. We liked our parish church council to be relaxed. We found that, we would be often making gentle jokes at each other's expense. And because our PCC meetings were not the most organised, that's why we used to call ourselves Llandibli. Now, Rod Martin expresses these feelings of fun and humour in this way. The pleasant emotion associated with humour, which is familiar to all of us, is a unique feeling of well-being described by such terms as amusement, mirth, hilarity, cheerfulness, and merriment. It is closely related to joy and contains an element of exaltation and a feeling of invincibility, a sense of expansion of the self, which the 17th century English philosopher Thomas Hobbes referred to as sudden glory. Now, I can't describe any of our meetings as having any element of sudden glory, to be honest. But it is interesting that Martin, who is not in any way a theologian, he's a humour theorist, a psychologist, uses a religious term in order to describe the feelings of a humorous encounter. Now, my first incumbency had a slightly more formal parochial church council, but we still had people who liked a laugh and a joke. So when I was first a vicar, we had two people who acted as sidesmen, and one was very tall and thin, and the other one was very short and fat. And they used to refer to themselves as Laurel and Hardy. And I arrived there when I just had maternity leave, and I was about 28, 29, so I was very, very young. It was my first experience of being, the vicar of my own church. So Laurel would pull my leg a lot, and he had such a dry sense of humour. I never used to know whether he was having me on or not. But actually, he was always having me on. I should have realised that. So he told me with an absolute straight face, because Hardy always gave sweets to people. He always had a packet of sweets, and everybody came to church, he gave them a bowl sweet. And he honestly said, oh yes, there was a sweet shop that's just closed down before you've arrived. And Hardy has brought up all the stock, and that's why he's giving everybody sweets. And I was kind of, you know how you are, you kind of go, oh, that's kind of him, kind of thing. But as I went on, I realised that I could never tell the truth, what he was telling me. And I sort of felt that it was a really important way of keeping me in my place, really, in a good way, because I was there as the vicar, dog collar and all of that. But being told, you may be the vicar, but, we have the power here, sort of thing. But it did bring a sense of fun into church life. And, for me, it reflects the arguments, really, of Goto, that play, and in this case, humour, opens up new spaces for encounter in church life, and is a subtle reminder of the topsy-turvy nature of the kingdom of God, where power is turned on its head. Now, in my ministry as well, with people who are outside church, because I'm, being an Anglican, very often, if people didn't have a church connection, they'd come to us for funerals, and very often we didn't know the people who were asking us for funerals. And a couple of, about 10 or 15 years ago now, I visited an elderly woman who I'd never met before, and she'd just moved into the area and her husband had just died. And so in those situations, you never know what you're going to expect. So I went there, we had a nice chat, I planned the funeral with her. And then before I left, she really wanted to show me a card. So say her name was Beryl, which it wasn't, and then her husband was George, say. As I was about to leave, she got up and showed me this condolence card. And then she began to read the card, and it said, "Dear George, I was so sorry to hear of Beryl's death." And this person, she was a lovely person, and I don't think she had family there, but it struck me that she was desperate to share this joke with somebody, and that I was one of the few people that she thought might get it, because, other people might have been horrified at the thought of, her wanting to have a laugh about something that had happened to her. But the two of us were just laughing at the thought of her now having to ring up this person and try and explain that she was actually alive, but it was her husband who was dead. But it just struck me how important humour is in ministry, because it's a way of creating a bond with somebody, isn't it? And I actually found in most of my ministry that in the most traumatic of circumstances, people actually, they didn't want me to turn up with a sorrowful face and be all kind of miserable. They just wanted somebody to be normal with them and even have a bit of a laugh with. And then my final parish story really is that the first dying man that I visited, so, I'm there 25, 26, not really used to death much at that time. And I was being called to this guy's bedside, and because he had cancer, and, he was seriously ill, and really, he must have had a strong heart or something, because day after day, he was holding on and holding on. And I became very close to them as a family, him and his wife. And the practice in our parish was we'd pray for people who are ill every Sunday. And then there was a bit of a list. But the thing is, because, say, if the list had 10 people, we tended to pray their names in the same way. And then, of course, people dropped off the list when they died. So really, you didn't want to get too close to the top, because you'd know that you'd be sort of next, kind of thing. And then him and I were sort of joking about this, really. But then we thought that this man was called, and I've changed his name, but Arthur Thomas Peters, say. And this was the name that we were praying out loud in the services. But then I found out on one of the visits, because I think I looked at his bed, and at the bottom of the bed there was this name, Alan Thomas Peters. So when I told him this a few days before his death, I hardly had any voice or anything, but a few days before his death, his response was, "There's no wonder I'm not getting any better. This Arthur Thomas Peters is getting all my prayers." And when I repeated this joke, the joke that he'd made at his funeral, it's got the biggest laugh of my ministry, really. In weddings, you try and be light-hearted, but everybody's far too nervous, aren't they? In baptisms, people are far too nervous. But in funerals, it's a way of release, isn't it? A kind of a catharsis. So for me, this reinforces the view, really, that humour is a place of liminality, a way of playing with the new realities, as well as an instrument for catharsis. So clearly, it needs to be used with great care, reflectiveness and skill. But humour is important in building community, as well as a way of enabling people who are suffering to gain some relief from their situation and strength and imagination to face difficult and emerging situations. So we're nearing I've been going on for about 35 minutes, so I'm going to sort of come to land slowly, first of all, by looking at offence and jokes, and is there anything that can or can't be joked about? So the humour theorist Sophie Quirk, she suggests that joking is a form of risky social negotiation where normal standards are relaxed. And again, the one I've been returning to a lot, Bernard Schweitzer, argues that all humour is permissible as long as it is genuinely funny, and that no comedy should be deemed too offensive. And he says this, According to Stephen Gimbel, if a joke kills, i.e. if it stirs the audience to laughter, then it is a good joke, no matter how offensive its content may be. The goal of comedy is amusement, not moral progress, edification, or manners. Now, I fluctuate, so sometimes I think he's right. At the moment, I don't. But I think it's an important thing for us to think about, and maybe it'll be one of the questions that we have later. So the main argument for all subjects being allowable in comedy is that the implications of imposing limits on humour leads into discussions about free speech. So Rowan Atkinson, quoted by Schweitzer, comments in an interview with The Guardian, "The right to offend is more important than any right not to be offended, and that anything is fit to be joked about. In my view," he says, "the freedom of speech is at the core of a functioning and confident democratic society. This freedom includes my right to joke about whatever I choose to poke fun at, including matters of faith and religion." Now, as well as limiting free speech, the issue with enforcing a limit on what can be joked about is that people's tastes and sensibilities vary. In fact, Bernard Schweitzer researched attitudes about offence, and his findings were that there is no consensus about offence, with bland jokes being considered offensive by some and extreme jokes being regarded as inoffensive by others. Now, stand-up comedy is more than just entertainment. It's a space where tough and even taboo subjects can be explored in a way that feels safe and engaging. As Quirk points out, comedy's immediacy makes it a powerful tool for social critique. An event happens one day, it can be addressed in a stand-up routine the next day. However, jokes can also reinforce harmful ideas if not handled carefully, and can help normalise offensive points of view, such as racism, creating a damaging and hurtful atmosphere for some members of our society. In the right hands, comedy can open minds and spark change. It's a shared space where power is questioned and ideas are tested, and nothing is ever just a joke. However, context is key. The interesting thing about stand-up is that the idea of the room where the stand-up comedian is performing is a safe space where anything can be said. And this is important to think about if we accept the argument that comedy is a form of social play within a liminal space, which has the potential to be utilised to make politically or socially important comments. So Joe Wilkinson, the comedian, however quoted by Quirk, says, "I don't think there is anything that you shouldn't talk about, any subject that is taboo, really, because it depends how you do it. In very skilled hands, it's funny and it's insightful, and it's not just shock. In the wrong hands, certain topics should never be talked about." It's not just the person that's important, but the place too. Stand-up is a kind of social contract. We know what we've signed up for. Stuart Lee, who referred to the Sioux tradition clown, talks about how in the Holy Fool tradition there would often be a circle drawn, and anything that happens within that circle was acceptable, however shocking. And I've seen him do a routine where he's literally done that, and he's just kind of done that with his fingers and then said something. Shocking, probably. But the idea is that, you know, it's not just who's saying it, but where we're saying it, and the kind of idea of a safe space. So the issue with current jokes is that jokes can be told anywhere, can't they? So I think a joke that I would say here could land badly. A joke that somebody makes in an after-dinner speech could land badly. So an example of this is, I've put the picture there, haven't I, about all the complaints that with the Jeremy Clarkson joke that he made when there was a strike on, do you remember? And he made a joke that that everybody striking should be shot. Well, I'm sure he didn't mean that. I'm sure he didn't mean that dinner ladies should be shot. But it was where he said it, wasn't it? He said it on a BBC breakfast sofa. So it was the context, well, and he's, well, I won't say what I think of Jeremy Clarkson. But if the person and the context is both wrong, then there is going to be outrage, isn't there? So we're now going to just bring some of the threads together. So debates about humour are situated on the polarity between a free and embodied Christianity on the one hand, and a controlling and hierarchical Christianity on the other. The Church, at various times, has both embraced humour, as seen in the traditions of the Holy Fools or of Easter laughter, and sought to control it, especially within debates about taboos and offence within society. Humour is also a way of entering into the topsy-turvy sphere of God's kingdom, enabling a speaking of truth to power within and outside the Church. In a world where Christianity is being misappropriated to bolster oppressive political power and ambition, it is even more important to point to a Christianity which promotes freedom and flourishing for everyone, rather than power and control for the few. Goto's analysis of play as belonging to the realm of God's kingdom, as a way of reimagining and even reconstructing God's new creation, helps us also to understand humour within the Christian tradition. In my own stories, humour was a space where hierarchical notions of church organisation could be subverted. And these liminal experiences, like in my story about the man who was dying, it reminds us that humour can be a place to play around with reimagining the world as it is becoming for the participants, especially if they're in a liminal space, moving into death or moving into accepting bereavement. Humour allows us to speak about subjects which are difficult or normally taboo. Above all, humour is fun and is an important part of us as humans enjoying each other's company. It can build community and a positive culture where individuals feel that they belong and are valued for who they are, despite their quirks, for which they receive gentle teasing. Humour is an important part of human interactions. It is also a key implement in the toolbox of any minister who wants to build rapport with others in the ordinary as well as traumatic experiences of life. The potential for humour as a revolutionary as well as a potentially revelatory aspect of embodied human experience needs further exploration by public and practical theologians. This is particularly urgent given the cancel culture climate and the prevalence of notions of taboo, respectability and offence in all areas of public life. So I'd like to argue, though, for Christians to get involved more in humour and not to be afraid of it. Debates about what is acceptable and unacceptable to say in public life is too important for us not to be part of the conversation. We need to enter the conversations about how to build a healthy, happy society where humour is used responsibly to build people up rather than tear them down. We have an opportunity to use humour to speak truth to power, and we need to support those who do, even if the risk is that we have to wander very close to that boundary ourselves. Above all, we need to remind people that our faith is about joy, and we can't do that if we are seen to be humorless. So I've got some recommended books. So I'm very happy to send out the PowerPoint if you want to see, especially see the books. And I do want to thank Lydia and Julie. Julie, first of all, for the invitation to come and speak to you, well, about 2 years ago now, wasn't it? And for Julie and Lydia as well for all their help. It's been lovely to be here with you. And I was here as an external examiner up until about 2 years ago. So I've read lots of people's work as well who's doing degree level work, and it was great to see it. So anyway, thank you very much for the invitation.
thank you very much for that, Manon. I enjoyed it very much. So we're going to have some time for questions now, but I actually wanted to give you a minute or two in response to a suggestion we had to allow you either to turn to the person next to you to just briefly talk a little bit, because for some people we got the feedback that it helps them to be able to process so they can actually ask their question. And if you've already got your questions, brilliant, just hold on to it for those 2 minutes, okay? So literally give you 1 or 2 minutes, just either sit there and think, have a little think, to see if there's a question that you've got for Manon, or turn to the person next to you and have a little chat, okay? Right, everyone. So, if you can finish off your chat, that would be wonderful. Really great to hear that so many of you obviously so engaged by the lecture. Lots of conversation going on. So, yeah, I'd like now to open the floor to questions. Steve.
We coming up, or are we? Oh, we're ready.
James, pass the mic for us. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your paper. People are laughing at me because I often have many questions, and I have many questions. Thank you so much. One of the things that the talk put me in mind of was the song by Regina Spektor, "Laughing With." I don't know if you know this. So throughout it, she's saying, no one laughs at God in a hospital. No one laughs at God in a war. But at the very end, the song reconciles into this idea, we're all laughing with God. And there's something redemptive to laughter in the way that song unfolds. But that distinction between laughing at and laughing with, I wonder, does that help us understand the difference between humor and other things that make us laugh? Because it doesn't seem that everything that makes us laugh is humor. There's the attempts of the powerful to ridicule, which makes people laugh, but is that humor? And so, yeah, what theological work does that distinction do if we have it? One example, so I'll turn it into a question. Sorry, I'm doing the bad thing. One example would be Robert Jensen, who says that there's a distinction between God and the devil, and that God has humor, the devil just has wit. The devil is the one who laughs at people. God is the one who invites us into his joy to laugh with him. Yeah, so you gave us good examples of council culture and kind of official comedians attempting stand-up, but I'm just wondering about the way that churches have used laughter to oppress. So jokes at the expense of women in churches with only male leadership, jokes at the expense of people of other races or other religious traditions or other sexualities and so forth. Yeah, so I'm just wondering, do you think there's anything with that laughing with, laughing at distinction?
There is, and I suppose the phrase that I didn't use as well was punching up and punching down. So I think it is really, that's why I was saying this, we need to make good ethical decisions about humour, I think, because yes, so I was making a point, wasn't I, that humour can just reinforce, well, we've all been at the receiving end, haven't we, of being belittled or whatever, and it can be used, humour can be used to reinforce and make people feel bad, can't it? And it is a way of making fun of people. But I think what struck me about the Rod Martin book was that I hadn't quite realised so much that in the ancient world, laughter was just seen as negative because it was about mocking. So I think this idea of play and coming into God's new creation, which is a place of laughter, the Psalm 126, is a lovely image for us, isn't it? I don't know if that answers your question, but it sort of engages with what you said.
Yeah, no, thanks. I appreciate it. Helpful. I'll give the mic back, but while I'm doing that, I'll sneak in my second comment, which is that Julian of Norwich, of course, makes that distinction. She laughs at the devil.
Ah, yes. Okay. Yeah. Did it work?
Well, that's when she realizes that the devil's nothing at all.
Yeah.
She's just overcome with laughter at how ridiculous the devil is.
Yeah. Oh, and I wanted to say in response to what you said as well, I've been in church situations where there's been a lot of laughter, but it's been quite hollow. And I've sort of felt that there's like a group of people who are kind of trying to perform that they're getting on well, but underneath, you just know that they're not happy as well. Yeah. So it's more, laughter is a very complicated thing, isn't it? It's not just one thing or the other.
I know this may come across as a simple question, but I mean it seriously. What do you think that children can teach us about play and laughter?
A lot. Yeah, it's like the make-believe thing, isn't it? It's that, I don't know if do you enjoy playing with children? Kind of pretending to do cafe and, it's like a parallel world, isn't it? Where but I think what I like about Goto's work is that play is, again, I hadn't quite twigged, play is such an important part of life. And she argues that even worship is play. So, nativities, dressing up in worship, this kind of thing. It's all playing around, isn't it? Yeah.
And kids are very yes and play imaginatively, aren't they?
Yeah, and they get annoyed if you don't really enter into it as well. Yeah. Yeah. No, thank you.
Thank you so much. My work deals with the arts and creativity, which is, I consider comedy an art as well, but also the arts are often used as a revelatory or revealing of truth. And you hinted that, and I think Steve was getting at that a little bit with his question. My question, I think, is could you talk a little bit more about the relationship between humor and revelation?
So Sophie Quirk said it's like a momentary anesthesia of the heart, and I'm not sure that I agree with it. Is laughing like a feeling of nothing, or is laughing actually a feeling of the opposite, a deep connection? So yes, sorry. Can you? I've just forgotten what you asked me now.
I want to understand more about the connections between humor and revelation. So Steve was asking about laughing with and laughing at, and I think humor can be used for evil, which is the laughing at, but the laughing with, to me, it seems to me, would always be revelatory of some truth.
Yes, and I think revelatory here as well is like an actual experience of God as well. So Lydia said that I teach one module, which is Theology and Contemporary Culture, and we look at, whether creativity, how much of God is there in creativity, and there's a book called Real Presences by George Steiner, and he argues that, we really experience God in creativity and in these moments of transcendence. So I think this is an important aspect of it all. And I agree, comedy is an art form, isn't it, as well? Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm going to get told off because it's hardly a question, Steve. I'm thinking about body chemistry. I think that when we laugh, there's chemicals in us, and there's something you commented, and I think it's incredibly interesting for us to take further forward in the community idea, the community building possibilities of laughing together in church. I live in the Republic of Ireland. We have a lot of crack. We laugh and sit around at funerals until everybody's cried and laughed and told everything they can think of, and only then does it sort of communally end. So I was just wondering if you come across the idea of the kind of body chemistry contribution to how we are designed to be joy-filled people.
No, I haven't, no. But, I think you're onto something. But I think the laughing together, for example, one of the people that I work with, theologically we're very different, but because we've got a similar sense of humour, it works, so I think humour can transcend a lot of things, really. And as you were talking, I was thinking of Derry Girls, just the humour in the worst circumstances, isn't it? It's what keeps us going, isn't it? And I was thinking about this as well when a couple of nights ago I met up with a couple of friends and we just went out and just had a drink. And because I was coming to do this, I was just analysing what we were doing. But essentially, we're creating our own entertainment, aren't we? Everybody takes their turn to tell a funny story. And we laugh and we howl with laughter and we have a great time, don't we? Is there anything better than that in life? You don't have to answer that question.
Thank you, such a stimulating lecture. Wesley studies, and I'm thinking of a phrase that Wesley would often combine is holiness and happiness. And the way Wesley would define happiness is somewhat akin to what you were talking about, joy, laughter. And so I'm wondering, though, have you come across anything that combines humor and joy with piety? Because it seems in popular culture those two things are often antithetical.
No, I haven't, because I think people see them as opposites, don't they? And it is because, yes, it is this argument, the laughter is such an embodied experience. And I suppose piety tends to be like antibody in some way, I suppose. Do you want to respond to that?
Oh, that's the interesting thing about what Wesley's doing is he is combining the holiness and happiness and what seems to be among some of the more disenfranchised folks around the 18th century England. So it was fascinating that those things are combined in his theology.
So then is the problem then that all these movements that we've had in the church, they've been addressing social issues, haven't they, like, things like drink and things like that. So could it be then that a movement, like even like Methodism starts off as very embodied, but then because you had to tackle some of the social evils, could that be the reason? I don't know.
Interesting,
yeah. Yeah, I don't know. But I think there's a dichotomy there, and I don't know how to broach it, really.
Thanks so much for what has been a fascinating lecture. You've spoken a fair bit about humour and pastoral care. And one of the things that strikes me is humour is also sometimes a deflection, a defense mechanism, a kind of avoidance of exposure, which seems to me to be the opposite of that genuine corporate laughter, where actually you expose yourself and the things that matter to you. And I don't know if you could talk a little bit about what leads to that urge to cover your feelings by humour, particularly found in males of a certain age, I think. But you know, that sense of humor as a means of not exposing yourself, which is what you want humor to do, in a sense.
Yeah, can you explain a bit more what you mean? Because I find that idea odd, you see. So I mean, I know what you mean, but I can't think of any examples myself.
So I think when a conversation verges towards the kind of uncomfortable,
Yes.
you tell a joke, or you say, "Oh, that's just that,"
Yeah.
you know, "Oh, she's always like that," or you know, you laugh it off, or you kind of find a way of turning towards the comic rather than
Yes.
turning towards the significant. And so I suppose you've talked about humor as a doorway, kind of a door into emotional connection, and I really resonate with that. But I also, you know, recognize it as a means of avoiding it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've not thought of that properly before, but yes. Again, it's like it's a contradictory idea, isn't it? Because you can say something that's true, can't you? And then you'll think, oh, I shouldn't have said that. You say, oh, don't worry, it was just a joke. You know, we all do that, don't we? When you say something and you thought, oh, I've gone too far now, just say it's a joke. But then the opposite of that you actually just make a joke just to move on, it's not something I've thought about. But yeah, it does happen, doesn't it? Yeah. As a way of avoiding talking about things, yeah.
Thank you very much. It was a wonderful, wonderful presentation. And thank you, Lydia, for giving us a minute. So we kind of, again, said to each other how wonderful it was just to listen to your lecture today. My question is, have you thought about humor and laughter in relation to political structures? In some systems, I suppose, laughter is and humor is hidden sometimes, and sometimes not existent at all in any way and in any form. It's like a little bit like a book of Revelation, right? So you live in a particular system and you have to decipher humor to a degree that, as I said, it's not existent. So do you have any comments on that, and have you explored that thrust?
Not particularly, apart from this book, Laughter of the Oppressed, you know, by Jacqueline Bussey, and she says that laughter is very important because it's empowering. But it is, I suppose, if you were in a situation, I've been watching The Handmaid's Tale, so there's no humour in that, is there? Things are pretty bleak, and I think there's stuff like what was that film called with Stalin? But In the Thick of It people did it. Armando Iannucci. Death of Stalin, yeah. So I think you can joke in the worst of circumstances, can't you? And I think the Death of Stalin is a good, you know, is Stalinism funny? Well, it's not really, is it? But it is in that. Something like A Handmaid's Tale is so bleak that there's no humour at all in it. But I think it is an important part of resistance, isn't it? Because if you can laugh about it, if you're in an oppressive situation, if you can laugh about it, then you're still feeling empowered, aren't you? And at least you're resisting it. But I think if you're in a situation that you can't laugh about, then it's over then, I think, isn't it? Yeah, I think that's a really important insight. But I think, well, you know, we're talking about Ireland, Northern Ireland. You know, who would have thought that it would be possible to joke about the Troubles? But, you know, the Dairy Girls gave us a window into what people were actually like and how they responded. So I think it is catharsis. I think that that kind of laughter and that kind of satire is really important. Well, you know, the last couple of years, all the stuff that's been, I know there's been live streamed, but he can't get me here, can he, in the UK? You know, all the stuff about Trump and that kind of thing. You know, how can we get through that, you know, that situation without joking about it? I don't know. it's the last thing we can do, isn't it, in a way? But I think it's an important insight.
I have a more pastoral question or homiletic question. Talking about the difference between laughing at and laughing with, but it's often that preachers will use self-deprecation of some kind, and would love, as a preacher who's used a lot of self-deprecation and also found that some of it stemmed from insecurity and some of it also stemmed from wanting to make people feel safe, that I cannot take myself too seriously. I'd love just your comments on self-deprecation and humor and the form that plays in pastoral care.
Yeah, so have you found it works for you?
I was, it's pretty, I've been known as an easy target by friends, but I was a pastor in Germany for 4 years, and a lot of it rotated around. I preached in German, not perfect German, and a lot of it, I didn't have a sermon that wasn't in some part some self-critique of words I'd accidentally made up or combined or things like that. And it was actually for those in the congregation who had come, well, I think the Germans just thought it was funny, but for those who'd come as refugees, who it would have been inappropriate for Germans to make those comments to, but I'm kind of this white American on a service visa, it kind of made our church safer for them because the pastor couldn't speak the language perfectly. And so in that sense, it worked. It's probably mostly back to insecurity now that I'm in America, but that was just one example.
Yeah, I would think as long as it didn't do yourself down too much, because it can, like I was arguing, can be a tool, really, ministerially, can't it? Especially, like you say, when you were trying to make it a safe space for especially refugees and that kind of thing. So I think humour is an underrated ministerial tool, and as long as you felt good about yourself at the end of the day, then that's the important thing, I think. Yeah. But I think humour in ministry is tough, but we should use it. And in sermons, what I might have gone on to say is that the thing that I've learned about stand-up is that the best stand-up comedians are absolutely themselves, aren't they? They're quirky, they're themselves, they know who they are, there's a kind of authenticity about them. And I think it's true about preachers as well. Yeah. You know, don't pretend to be somebody else, isn't it? If you're yourself in a sermon, we were talking about this earlier, about the researcher being the instrument of their research. Authenticity is really important, and if it works for you, great. But as long as you didn't kind of, you know, go home and feel miserable. Not for that.
I wonder if you've been able to engage with it all. Obviously, I come from an American context, and one of the most, I think, beautiful prophetic traditions in American literature and preaching is the tradition of Black joy as resistance. And I think that some of what you're touching on, this resistance thing, has been really modeled in spirituals that came out of that. James Cohen's Spirituals and the Blues, beautiful book. And so I wonder, have you engaged or been able to look at any of that, and has that come in at all? Or do you feel it speaks to this context, or some of what you're saying about protest as laughter?
Yeah, well I think you see that because we're so nervous of it, we're far away as a church from engaging with it, aren't we, in a way? And as you're talking, I was reminded of, you know, James Cohen's work and saying how the spirituals and how just dancing and jazz and everything was a kind of a countercultural kind of way of helping people survive the terrible circumstances. I'm sure that's what his argument is, isn't it? Yeah. But I think, but as a church, you see, because we devalue humour, we're far away from it. I think we can see how dancing and music can be a good thing, because we've tried to stop people doing that as well, haven't we? Really. But but now we think dancing and music is great, don't we? But we're not quite there yet, I don't think, with humour and comedy, and especially because of this this kind of Mary Whitehouse and people like that, that you can't, and the worries about blasphemy and stuff. I think we're just very nervous about this kind of thing, so we've not engaged with it properly.
So I think we chatted a little bit just in our little bubble, but yeah, and I think it connects a bit with what Lucy was asking. So I was saying that as you were talking, this idea of kind of the cathartic element and the release, and I just wondered how that may have potential for helping to engage issues like negative tropes that black women or Welsh women in your work encounter, so like the strong black woman, not as a good thing. And I just wondered if something about the way that humour and play could be used maybe pastorally, and also I guess a side point to that is in connection to maybe place and person, which you talked about in your lecture being important. It has to be the right person and it has to be the right context. Do you think there's room for the use of humour or play to be used, I guess, in part of the healing process, maybe, and the reframing of self, where marginalised people have had tropes, etc., imposed on them, and that effort to become more themselves?
Yeah, definitely, because I think it's healing, because it's empowering, isn't it? Because you're, in making a joke about a difficult situation, you're sort of gaining some control over it as well. But I certainly think that there's potential for developing that further, especially in your work with womanist theology, definitely. Because this afternoon we were talking about, there's the trope of the Welsh mam, the strong woman in Wales as well. There isn't a lot of humour there, really, but I think it could be developed further, definitely. Yeah. But laughter is empowering, isn't it? It's The Laughter of the Oppressed, that book was very influential to me, actually, and in my work, yeah.
And do you think it depends on who and where as well? The whole, a little bit like the idea of, can anyone do any piece of participatory research? Can anyone do that, or does it need to potentially be the right people engaging and attempting that work? So not Jeremy Clarkson, for example.
Yes. Well, yes. Yeah, definitely. That's what we were talking about this afternoon, wasn't it? About the researcher being an instrument for research. Yeah.
More just of a wondering, really. I went to a comedy gig at a Christian festival, Spring Harvest, and I went with my brother-in-law, who is a comedian, and he said that was probably the worst gig that he's ever seen. It was Tim Vine, if you know him, and he, as a comedian, my brother-in-law was like, "Oh, that's such a hard room to work." He said he was like, "Why are Christians so bad at laughing?" And I guess I'm wondering about like risk and comedy and Christianity and mask wearing and perfection, and like the boundary line, to take a risk and make a joke, be cheeky, whether as Christians there's something a bit more loaded or a bit more at stake for us. I don't know, just wondering.
Yes, so when I was working for St Esther Diocese, we had an under-25s officer there who developed kind of these comedy nights, and a bit like the Spring Harvest one, really. I think the idea was that you could bring your non-Christian friends to it, and it would be a way of evangelising them and everything, but it had to be clean. So I don't actually believe in clean comedy. so I think something like Tim Vine, you see, he just tells jokes, doesn't he? So it's one joke after another. But I suppose if your comedy is based on who you are, so when I do stand-up, I will talk about funny things that have happened to me, or I'll talk about my husband and this kind of thing. And the thing is, it is oversharing. It's, you know, it's too much information, because you would say something in a comedy set that you would never say to a friend even, you know. So I think that's the problem with it all, is that I think things are funny because they're very close to the line. So is he famous, your brother-in-law? No.
No, he does stand up.
Yeah. I thought just in case I could get a contact. So I would agree with him. You see, I think this idea of clean comedy is just, well, what's clean anyway? You know, are you allowed to joke about farting? You know, pooing? You know, these things are funny, aren't they? Sex, oh no, we can't joke about sex. But, you know, that's funny, isn't it? Sex is funny. So, so the thing that I don't do is I don't swear, because I just don't think my mother would like it if I swore in public. But the thing I worry most about is that, you know, I would say something and I think, well, yeah, aren't they they're gonna say, well, you know, Manon, who's the vicar of such and such a place, said this. So I think we have to be risky, I think, but we have to back each other up with the risk, because, you know, you could get cancelled, couldn't you, for saying the wrong thing? But I suppose that was my plea towards the end, really, is that we have to be willing to take the risks and upset people and be sorry for upsetting people, because if Bernard Schweitzer's research is true, you can't tell what's going to offend somebody or not, really. Yeah, so I can't imagine anything worse than a comedy evening at Spring Harvest, to be honest. That sounds pretty grim. Was it grim?
Well, it was just kind of a bit awkward, because Tim Vine, he works the room, doesn't he? So he's meant to be bouncing off people, but everyone was trying to be too Christian.
Yeah, because I suppose, we wear a mask, don't we? Don't want to let it down. We're there with our friends. And yeah.
Last two questions, maybe? Paula, and then back. Okay.
Uncomfortable, but it's the last night we're doing this, so might as well throw it out there. Can you talk more, because I think the risk of policing, I think there is this, like, to be funny is to toe a line and then allowing other people, it's not our best behavior. Oftentimes it is a rugged, I'm going to show you more of who I am. But that policing thing is real. And then if you add in gender, race, all these things, cursing, which some of us are comfortable with and others are not, can you speak more into this idea of how do we create spaces and even use our power, some of us more than others, to allow for this sort of room? With Mary's questions, you kind of alluded to, like, having each other's back, but how do you see that? Can you lean into that? How do we do that in a practical way in a Christian environment, knowing that the risks are different for women of color versus a white man, or if you grew up comfortable saying bad words, whatever that looks like?
Yes, so like with, you know, racist jokes, sexist jokes, everything, a straightforwardly racist or a straightforwardly sexist joke is just going to make some people, it's just going to exclude, you know, some people, isn't it? So there are people that joke about those topics, but not in a way that makes people feel excluded. So that was the argument, really, that the problem with these sorts of jokes is that it sort of normalises these sorts of points of view, doesn't it? But if like a joke is turning something on its head, then it works better. But I'm trying to think, so can you think of a situation where, you know, have you been with a group of people and somebody's been offended because somebody said something, and have they sorted it out between them? And I think Christian community in reality has to be risky, doesn't it? Because if we're showing the real us, then we're going to upset each other, aren't we? We're going to do things that's going to be wrong. But if that happens, and that's true community then, doesn't it? And we forgive each other and work hard at our relationships. But I don't know many churches like that, really. It's all quite staged, isn't it? And we're all very polite. But I think, isn't it about not being afraid of offending each other? like offence isn't the worst thing in the world, is it? But we talk about it now as if it really is the worst thing in the world, and we kill people off by cancelling them, you know. Because I do feel for people who, you know, even though they've said really offensive things, but those people still had to live, don't they? They still had to shop. They still, you know, but we treat this is our way of, you know, treating people like pariahs in a way, isn't it? But I'm trying to think, how would we do it practically? I think just in our just normal everyday interactions and forgiving each other, really. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the thing I feel is the weight of the risk. I think, and not, it's the fear of, which I think a lot of women of color feel. It's the, to show up without my best behavior will be for me to show up as too much, too loud. Even in normal situations, you watch, you know, even women of color connecting, and we're loud and people are already uncomfortable and policing it. And God forbid, we're now towing the line. And so, yeah, I think you're highlighting the dynamic of this is risky, and it does ping a grief that is tied to the risk, and that not all risk is equal for everybody. And yeah, may we be mindful of the power that we hold or don't hold, and do our, like you said, do the work to create the kind of community that does that well.
And as you say, stand up for each other when we can see somebody else possibly being in a situation where they're very vulnerable. Yeah. Thank you.
One last question then from Steve.
Hello, thank you for a wonderful lecture. Just a question, as we have heard from many people, there is different kind of laughter and different situations about it. Do you think the society or education system is doing anything to educate people about laughter? Is it something that might be worth investing in investing in it? Yeah. Or no?
Yeah, I can't think. So we have a separate education system in Wales, and it's governed by our Assembly, our Senedd. But I can't think, in my experience, of... I don't think it works to address that at all. No, it doesn't. But you see, I would say that it's only the last, you know, I'm out of education for quite a while, aren't I, really? But it's only the last, say, 10 years that this cancel culture has really been really prevalent, isn't it, maybe? So before then, I suppose the church, we were more involved in it, weren't we? Because, you know, Mary Whitehouse, blasphemy, all of that. So it would be us who'd be policing what people said and did in the public square, whereas now no one's really interested as much in what the church has to say, I guess, about this kind of thing. But I don't think the education system at all tackles it, no. Do you think there's something that can be done there?
Well, there is certain frictions about it, isn't it? When you see people talking, or there is sometimes there is misunderstanding. Sometimes people have to move on, but what it seems to be sometimes that there is no clear understanding what the people mean when they laugh or smile, and sometimes people that are really upfront or with the power, meaning like they're in leadership, they sometimes dare to ask questions like, "What are you laughing at? What, you know?" And sometimes it's the timid people that laugh because they know that they cannot do anything about it, or probably they see different side effects or whatever they say, so they might have more than one answer to whatever they're saying. And that, for that reason, it could be very intrinsic. So for that reason, I thought, well, it would be worth doing a social, intellectual understanding about it, at least for a little bit, so people can get an idea that not every laugh or smile is offensive, and not every, is, I think, for me, I think it's worse, but I don't know, so that's why. Do you think that in the future will be something like that?
Yeah, and perhaps just education more generally, how people are different, and, be a bit more welcoming of, because different cultures will have different sort of social norms and things, won't they? And I don't think in the UK we're very good at, understanding that people mean different things by the way they are, yeah. So it could be just part of a general re-education, couldn't it, of just being more tolerant of one another, really. Yeah.
All right, so we're going to finish there. But thank you very much, Manon, and thank you for your great questions. Let's thank Manon.
Well, thank you very much for your welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everyone, and safe travels home.